Okay. Time will tell. So, this week's Parsha is Vayishlach. And in the Parsha this week, we have a story. One of the things that happens in this week's Parsha is the story of Avram of Yaakov, Avinu, wrestling with the angel, and then his name gets changed from Yaakov to Yisrael. So there's a very interesting thing interesting phenomenon. Avraham also had his name changed, right? Avraham originally, Yaakov's grandfather, his name was Avram. Put it on the board without a hey. His name originally was Avram. And then his name was changed to Avraham. So all that happened was this letter He was added in. And the Torah says, and your name will no longer be called Avram, your name will be called Avraham. And the Gemara says that as of that point, whoever refers to Avraham, it's actually a prohibition, an avera now, to refer to Avraham as Avram. Because the Torah says your name is no longer Avram, it is now Avraham. So the Torah said his name is not Avram, we're not allowed to refer to him as Avram. In this week's Parsha, we have basically the same thing. The Torah says, and your name is no longer Yaakov, but Yisrael will be your name. Yet we still are allowed to and do refer to Yaakov as Yaakov. The question is why? Why is it that when the Torah said your name is no longer Avram, it's Avraham, we're not allowed to call him Avram, but when it says your name is no longer Yaakov, it's Yisrael, we're still allowed to refer to Yaakov as Yaakov. So the technical reason is, or the evidence of the fact that the Torah allows us to refer to Yaakov still as Yaakov is that the Torah continues to use the name Yaakov after this point. So going forward, there are times he's referred to as Yisrael, there are times he's referred to as Yaakov, which means it's very clear in the Torah that the name Yaakov is still in effect and may still be used. As opposed to in the case of Avraham, once his name was changed to Avraham, the Torah never says the name Avram again. So when the Torah says your name is not Avram, it's Avraham, and it never uses the name Avram again, that shows that when it meant your name's not Avram, it meant your name's not Avram and we can't use it anymore. If it says your name's no longer Yaakov, but it's Yisrael, but it continues to call him Yaakov and Yisrael, that means when it says your name is no longer Yaakov, it doesn't literally mean that name is removed from you. It means your name is been enhanced, upgraded, whatever your name is now Yisrael. But the name Yaakov is still effective and may still be used. So the question is why, right? So now we understand what is the basis in the written Torah for the fact that halachically we're allowed to use the name Yaakov after the name was changed to Yisrael, but we're not allowed to use the name Avram after it was changed to Avraham. Why that's the case, we now understand. Or what's the basis for that halacha in the Torah, we understand. But the question is why? Why is it if once Avram's name was changed to Avraham, the former name is no longer allowed to be used? Why is that not the case with Yaakov? There's going to be something about the names Yaakov and Yisrael that result in us being allowed to continue using the name Yaakov even once his name was officially upgraded to Yisrael. So the names, let's have a look at the names Yaakov and Yisrael. So the name Yaakov, we're going to divide the names up two different ways, but one of them the word the ayin kuf vav refers to refers to deception. And Yaakov got the brachas in last week's parsha. How did he get the blessings? By deceiving his father. He deceived Yitzchak. He did the whole dress-up thing and all of that, and said that he was his son, Esau, ish. And so he got the blessings by deception. Now, the name Yisrael refers to, we have the straightness, which refers to his receiving those blessings in a way that was straight and open rather than deceptive. So the name Yisrael refers to some sort of higher state of being, perhaps, let's say, that at that level and at that state of being, there was no need for deception in order for Yaakov to get hold of the brachas, and that's what the name Yisrael refers to. It refers to this concept of getting the brachas directly, straightly, without any deception. Now, keeping this in mind, the question just got a whole lot stronger. If Yaakov refers to deception, and Yisrael refers to a higher state of being wherein he was able to get the blessings without deception, once the name was upgraded to a point where deception wasn't necessary, why would we still want to keep the name Yaakov, which is an allusion to deception? And the answer is that it all comes down to why we're here, why the world exists, why every single one of us is here, why we're alive, why we were created the way that we were, and why we have the struggles that we have, and why the things that are difficult for each of us, which is different, right? Every single one of us. There are obviously some general categories of struggles that are pretty common and universal, but every single one of us has our own specific things that, we struggle with particularly. And all of this, obviously, it has to be that all of that has a purpose. Because if there was no purpose to that, it wouldn't be the case. Hashem wouldn't have created us with these challenges and difficulties, etc., if there wasn't a purpose in them, if they didn't have a function and a reason. And if they weren't going to introduce something beneficial and valuable and meaningful to our lives, Hashem wouldn't have done that to us. So the question is, what is that purpose? What's the point? What's the value in it? Now, we know that there are a number of different texts that describe a number of different reasons why Hashem created the world, a number of different motivations for the creation of the world. One of the ones, or the one that's emphasized the most in Chassidus, and it's quoted in Tanya from a Medrash Tanchuma, which says, Hashem wanted to have a dwelling place in a physical world. Hashem wanted to be integrated into physical reality. Now, I want to talk about what the word betachtonim means, in the lower world, in the physical reality. Because we could think of it as just being like the geographical location. Hashem wants to be integrated where? Into this world. Okay. That's true, but that's far from being all of it, from being the full picture here and the full meaning of saying Hashem wants to be integrated into the world. Because let's say that Hashem is integrated into the world, and let's say, for example, that Hashem decided, you know what, I want to be in the world, so Hashem shows up and integrates himself into the world, which he could do, obviously, right? Hashem can and could do anything he wants. If Hashem was to show up and to integrate himself into the world, that process of integration, as far as the nature of physical reality is concerned, that process of Hashem having been integrated would be artificial or imposed, right? The process by which Hashem was integrated into the world was by something outside of the world, non-physical, pushing the integration, Hashem making himself become integrated, which is not really a real integration per se. It's Hashem imposing himself on the world. Hashem, injecting himself into the world, let's say. And that's not going to be the same as, let's take a bit of a detour for a minute. And when it comes to us dealing with personal issues, issues in our heads, and we all have issues in our head. Issues in our head is maybe just a more mundane way of saying, or a more layman's way of saying psychological issues. We all have things, fears, whatever it is, anxieties, concerns, worries. We all have our own experiences in these categories. And, and I can attest to this as a parent very clearly. When you try to override an anxiety or a fear, or to say, don't worry, there's nothing to be afraid of, the only thing that's going to happen is it's going to get worse. Or at the very least, it's going to stay the same. Right now, if we think of this even biologically, right? Biologically, fear has a function. And the function of fear is to protect us from things that are dangerous, right? So what is fear? Fear is a sensation that we experience when we perceive something as being a threat, right? That's basically what it is. That thing is scary, i.e. that is dangerous. That's a threat to me. Therefore, I feel afraid. So we have a sensation of feeling that we experience when something is perceived as a threat, which drives us to protect ourselves from it. Ooh, that's scary. I.e. that's a danger. I need to protect myself. I need to run away. I need to put up a barrier, whatever it is. I need to protect myself from that threat, from that source of danger. So that's the function of fear. If we think about this, very technically, right? Fear is a phenomenon that's built into the physiology of our brains, that we experience fear when we perceive something as a threat. Now, let's say that we tell ourselves, oh, don't worry about that. You don't need to be scared. If imagine that we're writing the code for the fear program because we want people to be protected from danger. Now, if you're writing the code for the fear program, for the app of fear in your brain, then it almost would be common sense to say, well, if someone is so afraid of something that they're trying to shut out the fear and convince themselves that they don't need to be afraid because their fear is too much to handle, what that means is you need to be really, really scared, right? So when we try to go into denial about fear, what that does is it actually sends our brains a message that this thing is so scary, we need to deny the fear, which just makes us more scared. So denying fear just doesn't work. It's not effective. What is an effective way to get over a fear is to engage with it and to say, okay, I'm afraid of this thing. And there are, different variations of this. There's cognitive behavioral therapy. There are different ways of going about this, but is to talk it through. And just as a parent with a child, number one is you have to acknowledge it. If you don't acknowledge the fear, it's just going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And that's the reason, because our brains are saying, this thing is so scary that I'm trying to be talked out of the fear to protect me from the fear, which means I need to be really scared. So denying a fear just reinforces it. It's just reality. That's the way it works. Step number one is acknowledge the fear and then deal with it, work with it. Acknowledge, okay, yeah, that thing is really scary. And let's say, for example, even, I don't know, a fear of dogs. I'm just bringing a specific example so we can make it tangible and address it directly. If a kid is in the park and they're scared of a dog, saying, don't be scared, is not going to help. It's just going to make them more frantic. It's like, this thing is so scary. My parents are trying to tell me I shouldn't be afraid. You get more scared. Right. But if you can have a conversation and talk to the kid and say, you're afraid of dogs. I know dogs are scary. They're strong and they can bite. So number one is the fact that you're not scared to talk about it already makes it a little bit less scary. Right. Because the kid sees, oh, it's not so scary that we can't talk about it. We're allowed to talk about it. Okay. So it's not that scary. And then if you can engage with it and talk about it, and talk about how it's scary and why it's scary. And then discuss, well, have you ever seen a dog bite someone in the park? Like, there are dogs all the time, right? And they're scary and they're strong and they could bite, but do they? And you have a conversation and then get the child acknowledging their fear and validating the fear, and then working with the fear mechanism to bring them to a point where the fear no longer needs to apply to the dog. Then by means of that process, the child can become less afraid of the dog. right? So the effective way to become less afraid of the dog is not to deny the fear. That makes it worse. The effective way to become less afraid of the dog is to engage with the fear, to acknowledge it, validate it, and then engage with it. And when you engage with it, you can actually get to a point where the fear can now become reduced, right? So how do you actually address the fear most effectively? By working with the nature of the fear itself. So what we've done is we've worked with the fear to get to the conclusion that we want. Why? Because fear is a part of who we are. And if we want to work with ourselves, the most effective way to do that is to work with these things that are features of who we are. And trying to impose on that as opposed to work with it, it's not effective. It just doesn't do the job and it makes things worse. And the truth is that this same idea applies to the concept of Dir B'Tachtonim, of bringing Hashem into the world. Right? And let's say, for example, what you have this conversation with a child and you help them process the fear and get to that point. That will stay with them days, weeks, months, years after this conversation, right? Because what you've done is actually work with the fear to change their state, change this child's state of fear. You've worked with the person and with the features of their personality. So you've gotten to a place where by working with the fear, sometimes you might be able to say, you tell the kid, look, you don't have to be scared. I'm with you. I'll protect you. It's fine. That may work up to a point, but the minute that you're not there, it's useless, right? Because you haven't worked with the person. When you've worked with the person and worked with the fear, you've developed the fear itself so that the nature of this child's fear of dogs has now changed and it's different. And you've achieved a change in the nature of this child's fear. And because you've worked with the fear and changed the fear itself, you can walk away and never address it again. And that change will be long lasting because you've actually affected a change in the nature of fear itself for this child, for this person. Right. And this is kind of, that it's by having that conversation. Don't be sorry. It's a very important question, and this is true. It's true, with fears and anxieties and all these sorts of things. Sometimes we need help if it's a real serious thing. We need help of someone else who can help us train ourselves to have these conversations and to work these things through. But, if we, instead of being afraid of the fear and anxiety, we engage it, acknowledge it, validate it, and then talk about it and address it and say, well, why am I afraid? To what degree do I really need to be afraid? Is this fear necessary? Does it make sense? Is it statistically valid? What's the likelihood of things going wrong? And really think about these things. And, and it takes courage and bravery to do this. It takes a lot of courage and bravery to face even the thought of fear. A lot of times people are like, no, don't even mention it. Don't even say it. And there is such a concept in Judaism of ayin hara and things like that. But, sometimes if someone's really struggling with a fear or an anxiety and things like that, the way to get through it is to work through it and to face it up and to acknowledge it and validate it and then work through it. And it does take a lot of bravery and courage to do that. But ultimately, that's the way. If we can have that conversation and talk about what we're afraid of, why we're afraid of it, to what degree do we need to be afraid of it, to what degree are we exaggerating it and taking the fear out of context, etc. And if we can work through that and process that fear, we can oftentimes get to a point where we can start to become more comfortable and less afraid. But the only way to get past that is to have the courage to address it and work with it. And once we've worked with it, we can actually alter our personal fear of something because we've worked with it and changed the nature of our sensation of fear or anxiety, etc. Right? But you can't do that by denying it. You can only do that by acknowledging it and working with it and working through it. And the reason that can have a long-lasting impact is because we've worked through it and changed our fear itself. We've changed the fear that we experience. So now when that fear is activated, it's a different fear to the fear it was before because we worked with it to get somewhere and to make some progress. So the nature of the fear has been altered, and that's the objective. And what that means is, again, because we didn't shut it down, if you shut something down, it could always just come back, and then it comes back the same as it was before we shut it down because we didn't do anything to change it. If we work to change the fear itself, yeah, it'll come back, but you know what? What's going to come back is the new and improved and changed fear, which means that the progress that we've made is permanent because we've changed the fear, rather than shutting it down, where the progress, even if you could effectively shut it down for a time, which sometimes we can for a time, it'll come back the same as it was, if not worse, and it'll come back more aggressively. And the truth of Dira B'Tachtonim is the same. Hashem wants to be integrated into the world, not imposed upon the world. For Hashem to show up and say, I'm here, I'm integrating myself into the world, ultimately, Hashem is imposing himself on the world. So yes, Hashem can integrate himself into the world, but if that integration happened by means of Hashem imposing it, rather than it being affected by means of a worldly process, the nature of the world hasn't changed. Hashem wasn't integrated into the world. He didn't become a part of the world. He was imposed on the world. If we can work with the world by means of worldly processes to bring Hashem into the world on the world's terms, using the world's own processes naturally, then Hashem actually gets integrated into the fabric of the world. And this is why mitzvahs are always so physical and tangible. Mitzvahs are actions, right? Could Hashem, Hashem wants Shabbos candles, for example, right? Hashem wants us to light Shabbos candles. Could Hashem just make it such that when, imagine that as Shabbos is coming, we wave our hands 3 times over the candles and boom, they burst into flames. That would be like super cool and inspiring and exciting for the first 3 times, at which point it will just become routine as striking a match. But that's not a physical process, right? When the phenomenon that, friction creates heat, and when you have certain friction affected in a certain way between the match and the box of matches, that the heat is generated enough and it's generated in proximity to a material that's very flammable. So when you strike a match, it catches on fire. That's all physics right there, right? All we did. And so what did we do? We took energy that our bodies obtained from food that we ate, those calories. We used those calories and that energy to contract our muscles in such a way that we created a striking action. We struck the match against the matchbox. That was friction. The friction generated heat, and the matches are designed to be very flammable in the presence of the heat that results from that friction between the match and the matchbox. And now the match is on fire, i.e. the match is burning and giving off a huge amount of heat, energy in the form of heat and light. That's all physics so far. That's all just natural worldly processes. Question?
Okay. You just said that we should bring Hashem into the fabric of the world on the world's terms, so that it feels like a seamless integration and it's not like Hashem imposing himself. But if Hashem created the world, then he also created the terms of the world, so it's up to him to decide
That's such a good question. Okay. Hashem created the world. Hashem created laws of nature, right? So yes, the laws of nature are subject to Hashem, and Hashem created them. So the laws of nature themselves are a creation. Once Hashem created the world, the universe, and the laws of nature that govern its function, Hashem wanted to then be integrated into that through those laws of nature. So it's true that the whole concept of laws of nature Hashem created because he felt like it. That being said, ultimately all of this is because it's what Hashem wants. If Hashem wanted to impose himself rather than be integrated, then that would be the more valuable thing, right? The reason it's more valuable is because that's what Hashem wants, ultimately. But the fact is that is what Hashem wants. What Hashem wants is to be integrated into the world in a way that that integration is a part of the natural world rather than something that's imposed on the world, right? So I guess the answer to your question is It's true. That's correct. It's not like this is objectively more valuable, because everything is subjective to Hashem at the end of the day, including the laws of nature. That being said, this is the way Hashem designed it and the way he wants it to be.
So our agency as beings created by Hashem is illusionary, but still nonetheless important, like, because it's what we can perceive with our limited brains. Like, it still counts.
I would say it's more than that. Our agency is real and true. It's likely much less prevalent than it appears to us.
Okay.
So the Torah says that, well, first of all, one of Rambam's 13 principles of faith is reward and punishment. Now, if agency were an illusion, then reward and punishment would be totally unfair. Right? It wouldn't make any sense. It would be a game which would make reward and punishment unfair.
It is a game. I believe.
What's a game?
Life.
Depending on what you mean by that, I totally agree. Life is absolutely a game. Sometimes it's fun. A lot of the time it's not. It's very complex. He is. That being said, Torah does acknowledge that we do have. See, here also I would add in a specific adjective. So there's there's terminology which means bechira chofshis, which is free choice, which we could call agency, perhaps. And I'm assigning the English terms here, suggestively. I'm suggesting that this is the case. And then there's what's called bechira amitis, which is true agency. Now, a lot of the free choice that we have, the agency we have, we choose what to eat for breakfast, we choose what to eat for lunch. A lot of that isn't necessarily true agency. A lot of that agency is an illusion. Whether we turn right or left at the traffic lights, right? Sometimes you're like, shucks, I was supposed to turn right, I turn left. And then it's like, relax, Hashem's running the show. If I turn left by mistake, it was for a reason. Yes, I'm going to run late, but I'm on the way to a business meeting and this might cost me the deal, but maybe I'll bump into someone else on the way because I turned left by mistake and I'm going to make a bigger deal with them. Obviously that's an oversimplified best case scenario and it doesn't always work out that way. But, when we make a mistake, it's for a reason. It's hashgacha pratis, which means then by definition that when we decide between turning right and left, it's not actually true agency. It seems like agency, and perhaps that agency is actually an illusion. That being said, the Torah says very clearly in a number of places, in Torah Sheba'al Peh, in the oral Torah, that when it comes to decisions between right and wrong, we have true agency. Now, and I've addressed it before, I think, in this class, that to me personally, the directionality here is the opposite of the way it is for most people. For most people, it's like, we have free choice. And sometimes, we think we have a choice, but we don't. To me, from a purely material or biological perspective, true agency is actually a complete and total illusion. Because agency happens at the level of neurochemical reactions in our brains, which are a result of the chemical circumstances in our neurons. Which means that what feels to us like a choice isn't actually agency. It's something that's happening in our brains that seems like a choice to us. And to me, the real, the chiddush, the novelty is that when it comes to right versus wrong, we actually have true agency, bechira amitis, which means we do have the actual ability to make a decision against our neurobiology, our neurochemistry. But that's the novelty, and that's only because Hashem gave us Torah and mitzvahs and wants us to have the ability to decide between them. So Hashem created this unnatural phenomenon of true agency between right and wrong. But it's only specifically in the context of choosing between right and wrong that we necessarily have real true agency. All the rest of agency between what to eat, etc., if it's not a question between right and wrong, kosher and non-kosher, for example, but it's a question of what do I feel like having, that agency may well indeed be an illusion and a result of our neurochemistry.
I'm having trouble understanding the context of the word agency within the field.
So by agency, I mean actually choosing for ourselves. So a lot of the choices we make we're not actually deciding freely. The decision is being made by our neurobiology, by our brains and the neurochemistry in our brains. And a decision ultimately is a phenomenon that happens in the brain. And it's the circumstances in the chemistry of our brains that decide what decisions we make. Right? You know, which is why genetically, you know, a lot of preferences are going to be hereditary. Part of that will be genetic and part of it will be upbringing and, you know, what we're accustomed to, nature and nurture. And ultimately, you know, decisions are made in our brains, and our brains are biological organs that make decisions based on electrical activity, right? So ultimately, the decisions we make, biologically speaking, are just an outcome of our neurochemistry, which means we didn't actually decide for ourselves. The chemical circumstances in our brains decided. Now, it feels like a decision. Did we make the decision? Yes. But we didn't really make the decision freely. We made a decision which was an outcome of our neurochemistry. So it's not really a true independent free choice that we could technically have truly chosen otherwise. That's what I mean by agency. We actually made the choice when we could truly have been free to choose otherwise. When most of the time our decisions are just made by our neurobiology, which means that the true agency, the fact that we could have chosen otherwise, is really an illusion. But Torah tells us that when it comes to choosing between right and wrong, we do have true agency. We do have the ability to choose both options, and then we decide, which is why reward and punishment is true and real. But that only necessarily applies when it's right versus wrong, not just right versus left. Okay.
אז כאילו האזור של הבחירה החופשית זה כאילו משהו שהוא בתת מודע, כאילו, אתה יודע מה זה תת מודע? זה כאילו, you are not aware, אז כאילו זה רק הבחירה החופשית, אז זה כאילו ממש אזור כאילו קטן, אז חוץ מזה כאילו כל הדברים זה בחירה אמיתית.
הבחירה האמיתית זה רק כשאנחנו בוחרים בין נכון ולא נכון, טוב ורע.
כן.
כל הבחירות האחרות זה לא טוב או רע, זה רק, מה אני אוכל, או אני אלך לצד ימין או לצד שמאל, זה דמיון של בחירה. זה בחירה חופשית, לא בחירה אמיתית.
אז כאילו הבחירה החופשית זה משהו מאוד מאוד כאילו...
הבחירה האמיתית זה מאוד קטן. רוב הבחירה זה דמיון של בחירה. האמת זה רק תוצאה מהמצב בתוך המוח. Yeah, makes sense? הבחירה האמיתית זה רק בחירות בין טוב ורע, בין נכון ולא נכון, מצווה עבירה. כל הבחירות שזה לא טוב ורע, זה דמיון של בחירה. מובן? Okay, Baruch Hashem. Okay, so Hashem decided to create physical reality. And physical reality is governed by laws of nature, which includes the physics of the striking the match and the friction and everything else, right? Now, if you strike a match and hold in your hand, the candle's still not going to light, right? Why? Because the candle has a wick, and the wick, if it's exposed to sufficient heat to catch on fire, the wick will start a reaction of burning energy and releasing it as light and heat. And that energy is going to come from the wax or the oil or whatever it is. The wick is going to absorb wax or oil, which is why the wick in a candle will burn down till it hits the wax. Then wax melts. Once the wax melts, it's in a liquid state, it can start to be burnt and the energy consumed. And that's what happens. The wax or the oil gets less and less and less because it's been metabolized by the flame, which releases the energy into light and heat. But you have to put enough energy into the wick in order for it to catch on fire, for it to start releasing the energy from the fuel source, which is the wax or the oil. And this is all a physical process. Now, could Hashem have made it such that we wave our hands 3 times and the lights burst into flames? Yes. Could Hashem made it as such that when that happens, we fulfill the mitzvah? Yes. But then Hashem and the divinity of the mitzvah wouldn't have been integrated into the laws of physics and into the molecules in the fuel and into the light and heat that that passed from the match to the wick to make it catch on fire, and into the calories that we got from our food that gave us the energy to strike the match, and into the flammable substance on the match, and into the phenomenon of friction that made that heat, etc., etc. So when we do the mitzvah by means of a worldly process, because we're working with the laws, with the world through the laws of nature, the laws of nature and these worldly processes themselves are being uplifted and are being made divine. So could Hashem just insert himself in? He could. But that would be a far less fulfilling and satisfying integration into the world. When Hashem's integrated by means of worldly processes, by means of the physics and the chemistry of the universe, that integration is so much deeper. The integration has become a part of the fabric of the world itself, right? It's the same thing when we work with the fear, rather than doing something to it, we change the nature of the fear itself, and that change is permanent and valuable. When we integrate Hashem into the world by working with the laws of nature and chemistry, the laws of nature and the physics and the chemistry and everything else, we're integrating Hashem into the world by means of worldly processes, into the nature, into the laws of nature, into the processes of nature. And that's so much deeper and more valuable and meaningful in integration. Now, we're going to go backwards again towards the psychology, the same way that mitzvahs are, right? And it's the same thing with tefillin, right? The Zohar talks about the meaning of the mitzvah of tefillin and the meditations of unity of Hashem and everything else that goes, based on the psukim and the Shema and the verses inside the tefillin. That's amazing. You could meditate about the unity of Hashem day and night, or I could, if I didn't put on tefillin, I didn't fulfill the mitzvah. Even though the intent of the mitzvah and the kavanos, which is the word that's used in Kabbalah, I fulfilled and meditated on, if I didn't do the mitzvah, zero mitzvah. I put on the tefillin without any meditations, it's 100% mitzvah. Why? The nature of the mitzvahs is tied to physical objects, physical actions, physical processes, because the objective is the mitzvah. When I put on the tefillin physically and I wrap them, I'm integrating divinity into the calories I used to got the energy to do the mitzvah. I'm integrating divinity into the muscles that I used to perform those actions. I'm integrating divinity into the leather and the hide and the ink on the parchment, and the food that the cow who this parchment and leather came from ate, etc., etc., etc. So Hashem wants to be integrated by means of worldly actions and worldly processes to get integrated deeply into the fabric of the world. Anybody heard of the clothing brand Fubu? It was all the rage quite a while back. Like a long time ago, decades ago. I remember it from when I was a kid growing up in Australia, but it was an American culture thing. Fubu was a clothing brand that stood for us, by us. It's kind of like the idea of grassroots. It's like, this is a clothing brand. It's our culture. We're making it for us, by us. Right? And Hashem wants to be the same sort of thing, to be in the world, but also by the world and through the world. Because by working with the world, then the laws of nature themselves and the world itself, the integration is deep and it's on the world's terms. That's true physically of objects and mitzvahs. It's also true of us and our nature. Hashem doesn't just want us to be, ham kumbaya perfect and just get all the struggles that we have and just for our struggles to cease to exist. Now, do we set that as a goal to get rid of our struggles and the negative things in our nature? Of course we do. But when we work through that process and make that happen, that is integrating Hashem into those. But, meanwhile, Hashem wants us to acknowledge our struggles and the things that try to pull us away from Torah and mitzvahs, and to work with them. And sometimes we have to trick ourselves. Sometimes we have to gamify things. I'm a big believer in gamifying things if it gets us towards our objective. And what I mean by gamifying is turn it into a game, make it fun, make it a challenge. If if there's something that I'm supposed to do according to Torah and I struggle with it, if I can find a way to make it fun and exciting, even if ultimately, hypothetically, ideally, I should do it just for the right reason and not because it's fun and exciting, the bottom line is I'm struggling with it now. And if finding a way to make it fun and exciting is going to make it easier for me to ultimately and make it more likely that I'll do the right thing effectively, go for it. Which means if we have to work with the weaknesses of our human nature, work with them if that's what it takes. Sometimes we have to fool ourselves. Sometimes we have to trick ourselves. Question?
So why is it so, like, I know that you're supposed to study Torah for the sake of it and not for, like, well, this is being bracha and whatever. So why is it so, if we're allowed to gamify, why can't we go through that, like, I guess, veneer of thinking it's going to benefit us and like strongly believing that the ultimate result is having studied Torah?
So I would say one is the objective and one is the pathway. So ultimately, right, so on one hand, it says we should only learn Torah lishma. You shouldn't learn Torah knowledge, for ulterior motives. And actually, there are some pretty harsh things, that the sages said about learning Torah for ulterior motives. That being said, the same sages also say that a person, la'olam yilmod adam Torah shelo lishma, we should learn Torah for ulterior motives if we are not in a position to learn it without ulterior motives. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, if we're not going to learn it without ulterior motives, learn it with ulterior motives, because at least you'll learn it. And you know what? Once you learn Torah, you connect to Torah and you get the light of the Torah in your soul, and that will bring you closer to a place in which you'll be able to learn it without ulterior motives. Right, so ultimately we shouldn't need to gamify things, but the reality is that we all know that we need to, right? And is the goal, the objective is to ultimately one day, hypothetically, ideally get to a place where we don't need to. That is ideal. It is ideal. We're not denying that. That being said, Hashem chose intentionally not to create us that way because he does want us to work through that and to work with who we are, and to gamify things as necessary, and to deceive ourselves as necessary sometimes, and to trick ourselves into things. And that is what Hashem wants, because when we do that, we are integrating Hashem into the flaws. That it's all very nice to bring Hashem into our neshama, into spirituality. Big deal, whoop-de-doo. Bring Hashem into the flaws of our character, into our character flaws, and integrate Hashem into that. How much more novel is that? How much more of an achievement is it to bring divinity and to bring Hashem and infinity into the negativity of the flaws of our character traits? When we work with those flaws and do what we need to do to gamify things and say, I'm going to work with my flaws and make it work, trick myself if I need to, gamify it if I need to, I'm going to find a way to make this work with the flaws that I have. What we've just done now is create a situation in which our flaws are part of the process of bringing Hashem into the world. So we've actually uplifted and integrated divinity into our character flaws on their own terms. Not by doing the wrong thing, but by doing what we need to work with them and to gamify things and to deceive those flaws as necessary to make it happen. And the same way that when we work with a fear to get past it, instead of trying to shut it down or override it, the value and the outcome is so immeasurably more effective and productive and positive and long-lasting and meaningful. It's the same thing here. And this is why Hashem said, it's true that Yisrael is an upgrade to Yaakov. Right, so, and the name Yaakov includes two things. It refers to trickery and deception. Also has the name Akev, the word heel, in it, as opposed to Yisrael, which is Li Rosh, the head. So it's true that the name Yisrael refers to the head, the higher parts, the soul, and doing things in a way that there's no need for deception and gamifying because, we're in that state of being. And yes, that is the ultimate objective, and it is better and higher and ideal. And yes, the name Yaakov refers to the heel, the lower end, and the level at which we need to gamify things and deceive ourselves sometimes as necessary. And yes, that is an inferior state of being. That's true. But Hashem doesn't want us to just override that and eliminate it or deny it, because that denies Hashem the integration all the way down into the negative parts of our character and the flaws of human nature. We're denying Hashem that depth of integration. And Hashem doesn't want to be denied that. Hashem wants to be integrated all the way down into the flaws of our character. And that's why even once Yaakov's name was upgraded to Yisrael, he's still referred to as Yaakov. Hashem saying, yes, it's true, Yisrael is an upgrade, but that doesn't mean I want an end to Yaakov. Hashem still wants to be upgraded into our shortcomings, into the flaws in our character. Hashem wants us to work with them and to integrate him into them. If we don't work with them, we deny them, then they remain outside of the part of the world that Hashem is integrated into. Hashem hasn't been integrated into the flaws of our character flaws and our shortcomings because we didn't involve them in the process. Again, could Hashem integrate himself into them? Yes, but it wouldn't be on their terms and through their natural function, which would mean it's Hashem imposing and not truly integrating into the flaws themselves. But when we work with our flaws and acknowledge them and accommodate them and do what we have to do to gamify things and accommodate our flaws and get the job done, taking them into account and considering them as a real part of who we are, rather than trying to deny them, that's when we get the true integration of Hashem all the way down into the parts of reality that it's much more difficult and complex to integrate Hashem into. And that's what Hashem wants. Hashem wants that full, total, comprehensive, complex integration into all of the world, into the flaws and into the shortcomings. And the way to do that is to work with them, to acknowledge them, and to consider them a part of who we are and to work with them. Now, again, there's a little bit complex. Again, we have this, these two ideas in tension, because that doesn't mean we should say, oh, I have flaws and I'm not going to try to repair them and to get better because Hashem wants flaws. Hashem doesn't want us to have flaws. Hashem created us with flaws, which means Hashem wants us right now to be in a position in which we have flaws. Hashem wants us to work towards getting beyond those flaws and to becoming better people who have less character defects, less character flaws, less shortcomings. That being said, as long as those shortcomings do exist, Hashem wants to be integrated into them. So as long as we have character flaws, as long as we have challenges, as long as there are things that are difficult for us, we don't need to deny it. Hashem doesn't need us to deny those challenges. We need to work with them and do what we need to do to make them work and to get the job done and to gamify things as necessary, etc. That being said, at the same time, we can and should be trying to work beyond them and to get past them not by denying them and hiding them, but by developing ourselves to the point that those flaws no longer hold us back. So both pathways are involving a process of development and working with. On one hand, we do want to work to develop ourselves and get to a point where we are beyond these shortcomings. That being said, as long as those shortcomings are in place, Hashem wants to be integrated into them, which means we don't deny them, we gamify them. Question?
So if Hashem wants us to have the flaws and not only have them, but elevate them, so that's why we have Yaakov and Yisrael, but is that only in Galus?
Yes.
Okay, so when Mashiach is here, we're not going to have the flaws, so that's going to be no more yet. That part is going to be
correct, and that's why it says that when Mashiach comes, we are going to have a certain longing back to the time of Golus for that reason. Because when Mashiach comes, it'll be amazing. We will just imagine you literally see infinity. You see Hashem with your eyes everywhere you look. It's crazy. It also means an end to achievement, because when you see Hashem with your eyes, nothing's an achievement. It'll be amazing, but achievement has a certain value, and we're not going to have that option anymore, which is why it does say that when Mashiach comes, we are going to have a specific longing back for the opportunity to achieve that we have now, which we won't have then. which is the same idea that you're saying. It's that the ability to work with these character flaws. That is ultimately what achievement is. I mean, there are two kinds of achievement. Gamifying them is an achievement. Developing ourselves to the point that we get past them is a different variety of achievement. When Mashiach comes, neither of those are going to be in place. So yes, it's going to be amazing, but we are going to be missing the value of achievement, which is why it says, when we say Shema, it says, Hashem says, I'm commanding you today. When Mashiach comes, the achievement aspect of mitzvahs is going to be history. It's for now, today, here. As difficult as Golus is, and as much as we do long for Mashiach and await Mashiach and want it to happen 100%, hopefully, and certainly at some level, and at the fully conscious level, hopefully as much as possible, because let's be frank, fully embracing the concept of Mashiach to the point that we truly desperately want it is, it could be somewhat of a complex relationship. Let's be honest. That being said, there are certain things that we have today that when Mashiach comes, we're going to miss it. And that is the ability to achieve today. L'chaim. Have a good week, everyone. See you next week.
What's going on?